Welcome everybody to the third meetup that AgileHub is organizing, and the second one of online. I wanted to say offline. The second one online. And we have one question for you because we cannot see you. We have a poll. How many of you have participated in any event that we have organized before? Can you answer yes or no?
So
Have you participated in
currently in your front end course?
In which one?
The front end course.
Front end. Yeah, front end. I will say just 2 words about it because things come together and connect to one another, and hopefully everyone can understand the context that we are in. Okay, so 63% of you have been before to some event organized by us, and 38% are for the first time, which means that 2/3 of you already know that we offer free education, that almost all our activity is pro bono, and when I say almost, I will explain what that means. You also know that we don't do HR, and your contacts are only for AgileHub and is held within AgileHub and are used only for statistics. And regarding some statistics, if Stefan can help me here a little bit, we created AgileHub 7 years ago. And we have organized more than 200 free training and workshops during weekend, and in the last few months also during week evenings. And more than 60 volunteers, IT specialists throughout these years have contributed in AgileHub. Some of them have left town, some of them have left the country, unfortunately. But currently are more than 40 of us active. We also organize Peak IT. Some of you may know about it. We will organize this year for the 3rd time. It is the IT community conference organized by community for the community. Starting March, we have started to organize the meetups. Why? Because we wanted to tackle also some more advanced topics that people with experience can grasp the overview of and then continue on their own. And for that, they don't actually need to attend a 5-hour workshop, and the information that they need can be conveyed in, let's say, 2 hours. And this is why we do Meetup. Now, some of our activities is we allow sponsorships only for some of our activities, and Meetups is one of those activities that we accept sponsorship for. When a company sponsors us, they actually sponsor the IT community and they support the IT community. And why do I say that? It connects with the word almost that I used when I started. It's because the funds that we have, we return it and reinvest it in community by offering medium and long-term education programs for adults and children. This cannot be pro bono anymore because it requires a lot of effort, a lot of time and commitment. And this is why I say that any company that sponsors AgileHub actually sponsors the IT community, and we try to walk the talk, and the saying that a tide rises all boats, and we can all gain when the people in this area learn more and they share more. And there are two examples of programs that we launched this year. Could you back just a little bit?
Sorry.
Yeah. It is the 8-month long robotics and 3D printing program that we started with children in one school here in Brașov. It is on pause right now, of course, but we'll resume it on September. And last week, we launched also the 16-week-long front-end and React program. All of them are free. And on the next slide, you can actually see some pictures with children that attended the first 2 months of that robotics program, and you can see the joy in their eyes and how curious and active they are. So hopefully we managed to give an overview of our activities and why we do what we do. Now, when a meetup is sponsored by a company, then some experienced and technical person from that company has the opportunity to share their perspective on the projects that they have, the approaches that they have, the struggles that they had, and so on. And this meetup is sponsored by 3SS company. And the experienced person that is in front of us on the screen is Stefan Blickensdorfer. He doesn't live in Romania, but because it's online, it's easier for him to be here with us. And why do I say he's an experienced person and he's the right person to talk to you about the struggles and the journey that 3SS company had regarding the DevOps transition is because Stefan is the CTO of 3SS, and I will read just a few sentences because I don't want to be mistaken. His responsibilities include overseeing development and delivery activities across the company, providing leadership to technical specialists, as well as delivery and development teams. Stefan spearheads the company's technology roadmap and plays a central role in designing and delivering major customer projects. And I also know that he has started his own company, and he is also an entrepreneur. So that's all from my part. I will let Stefan take over and tell us all about the specifics of 3SS company and the area that they are active in, the peculiar characteristics in their activity and their DevOps transitions. Stefan?
Okay, thanks for the intro. Yeah, I had one slide about myself, just to give the context, but you summarized it, I think, much better than I would have ever said it. But I mean, shortly, I'm coming from a development background. Right? I used to be a web and a backend developer. This was still in the ancient days of PHP. And when JavaScript and Node were just about to start. Back then, I was, yes, a co-founder of a very small development and design agency. And then, meanwhile, since 8 years, I'm working for 3SS. I'm involved in various projects in the TV and VOD area, because that's also the focus of our company. And I'll give you a bit of an outlook about that later on without trying to do much of a company presentation. Regarding this presentation, I think it's also important to note that while I'm the one doing the talk, right, I'm actually more or less presenting work others did. Yeah. I just draw the short straw, and I'm the one to sit here and present it. But I think it's important to know that we have a DevOps team, and actually everything which I'm presenting here, the history around it, what we do, all the achievements. I think this is what this team has been driving, and it's been driving inside our organization. So yeah, kudos to this team, and just keep that in mind when I talk about we, or sometimes maybe accidentally even I. Usually it's this team which does the work together with the other teams. When we are talking about, or when I will be talking about the next things like challenges, learning, a little bit about what we are doing, I try to structure it, even though I think I failed with the structure, but let's say I want to give you a quick overview about who is 3SS and what we are doing, because I think it's important to understand that we have a little bit of a special niche we are working in when we talk about what DevOps means for us. Then I want to give you an overview about where our journey started. So this is like, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years ago. What steps we took so far, where are we right now, and have a little bit of a short case study. That's just to give you an example of where we see like the benefits of this new approach coming in and paying off. And then last but not least, a little bit more about where we are right now, and also give an insight in our setup. Yeah. So how are we doing the stuff? What tools are we using? How are we using them? And then the interesting part, the challenges and the learnings, I'll try to give them on the way, but I also try to summarize them at the very end. And some do's and don'ts in that. At any point, of course, if you have questions, remarks, comments, just interrupt me, and I'll try to answer them, or I have here a little notebook and I'll try to write them down and answer later. Yeah, that being said, let's go about who we are and what we are doing. So as 3SS, aka 3-Screen Solutions, we are specialized in front-end solutions. Everything around multi-screen, so this means mobile, TV, web, and set-top boxes. So the devices which you have probably at your home, you connect to the TV in order to watch TV through the cable, antenna, or satellite boxes. Right now we are around 200 employees, and I would say roughly 80% of them are part of delivery, meaning that these 80% are actually people who are really contributing actively to provide to delivering projects and are working either as a developer, as a QA, requirements engineer, etc. So we have a very small overhead of management people. We are organized in technology departments, so depending on the platform. So we have a very large Android department, a very large Android department, iOS, etc. And maybe that's also interesting when I later on talk about some of the things. So we are not a very hierarchical company. We try to be very flat. We have like these groups which are organized along their capabilities and interests. We are working with the Scaled Agile framework, or SAFe shortly. That's yeah, for those who don't know it, it's an approach to try to scale, that's the name, agile development practices from the small increments, meaning 2 weeks and 1 team, really on a broader scale. When you work with our customers, we talk usually about projects which are 12, 14, 18 months, and which involve a lot of teams. Yeah? And then when you only work in 2 weeks iterations with a development team following that approach, you have some struggles. You also need to onboard other parties, and that's where SAFe comes in handy for us. Historically, we have been in the past, I would say a classic, let's say body leasing or development outsourcing company. So our business was that somebody comes to us and says, okay, I want you to build me this application. Then they put a catalog of requirements in front of us, and we have been developing it. And we are in the ongoing transformation from that model to, yeah, we would call it maybe a product and solution provider, which in the end means that we are not only the ones who have to write the code, but we are also the ones who come up with design, definition, product requirements. And now the customers come to us and say, hey, I want a VOD solution, please build it. Yeah? And everything else has to be filled by us. I'm mentioning this because this also introduces maybe certain challenges to overcome if you come from a mindset where the customer used to tell you exactly what you need to do, and now they just tell you, do something, I want this in the end. Yeah. Maybe a little bit of a picture from what we are doing. When we talk about scaled agile framework, etc., that's usually something we show. This is like the PI planning, so the so-called program increment plannings, where us, the customer, and other involved vendors get together, and we do usually like 2 or 3 on-site workshops, 2 or 3 days on-site workshops to define the scope and the roadmap for 2 to 3 months. Now, of course, we all know that we are not doing that on-site right now. We also switched to do it remote. But yeah, I guess screenshots from remote sessions are not as sexy. So when I'm talking about our customers, what's the average profile of our customer? I said we are working in the VOD area, so our customers are typically operators and broadcasters. This means could be companies like Telecom, Orange. They're not our customers, but just to give some household names, we have customers like Comhem in Sweden, Carnegie Digital in the Nordics, Proximus in Belgium. We used to work for Swisscom. These are the companies. So companies which operate their own network, provide infrastructure for internet, maybe for telephony. They provide their own TV, meaning they have their own channels, they operate their own channels, and they give these channels to their users via broadcast, so antenna, satellite, IPTV, or OTT. And the main platform that usually customers come to us for is the set-top box, right? So while we do develop mobile, web, and all this other stuff, the lighthouse, so to speak, why customers want these services is the set-top box. And again, that becomes hopefully relevant a bit later in the story. Well, these customers, if I tell you names like Telecom, at least in Germany, you would know that these are very large organizations, very traditional, which are far from agile methodologies in details, right? Usually these companies work on 4 to 5 years product life cycles. When they talk about a fast release, fast for them means 2 months, yeah? So they have very slow release cycles and they have long product life cycles. If you give a set-top box out to the market, you need to assume that this device will be used for the next 6 to 7 years. And sometimes even without being connected to the internet, at least in Germany, if you know internet infrastructure, there will not be updates all the time, yeah, because we're very bad with that. So what you put out is there for 6 to 7 years. And we have an added complexity because when we talk about set-top boxes, these set-top boxes have usually customized operating systems, yeah, which are customized from different vendors. And because we don't only use IP-based technology, so not only OTT, but also broadcast technologies, there's more complexity because we need to also work with signals coming through cable, coming through antenna, and play this stuff. I tried to visualize this a bit more. So the things on the left, these are the set-top boxes, and I just wanted to illustrate very briefly here that our contribution is at the red box. So we do front end, and I called it support system. So a little bit of stuff around the front end, but mostly we supply front end. And we have to interface to backend systems, which are typically not done by us, which are done by partners, by the customers, and are already in the field, or even more so typically are ongoing development. And we have the middleware and the operating system to which we also have interfaces. The main one we are dealing with is Android TV. Yeah, so it's fairly close to the standard Android, I would say. And here the important thing to know is that when you release Android TV solutions, throughout this project, you have a certification process. Other than a typical application, which you just submit to the store, and then it gets a QA for 1 to 2 weeks. This certification process can take between 4 to 8 weeks, and it can take even longer. And this is because there are a lot of things on the hardware level checked. A lot of sub-certifications need to be done. And only after this is done, the application will be actually provided for a release. And I'm mentioning this because when we talk about all the typical DevOps streams, like releasing every day or multiple times a day, making rollbacks or fix forwards whenever you want it, all these ideas pretty much are crushed when you talk about a 4 to 8 week certification process for a release. Yeah? And this is when we talk about a lot of the things from how we see DevOps is also relevant to keep in mind. Speaking of DevOps, I think, what does it mean for us? Right? I mean, the typical definition is obviously DevOps is the idea of putting together development and operations, making them one team, and trying to minimize the gap and the friction between one part of the organization which is developing a solution and the other part which is operating the solution. I mean, everything else which is talked about in DevOps comes from this idea. As I just mentioned on the previous slides, 3SS is not really the one operating the solutions. Yeah. So in our context, 3SS is like the dev and the customer is the ops, because we do the development. Eventually we hand it over. We also support, but the actual operating and in a way also the responsibility towards the end customer. This is our customer. We don't talk to the users. We get the feedback from our customers about the users. And I think this is also important because this is a different mindset and a different approach to the whole DevOps idea than a company which is building and running their own product and their own solution. Another definition about DevOps, comes also out of the safe space. I mean, there are like tons of definitions about DevOps, but I like this one just for the clarity of, let's say, the 5 main areas which DevOps covers. And if we start on the right, one is, and this is probably what, including myself, a lot of people think first when they talk about DevOps, usually it's the automation stuff, right? So everything is automated, tests, builds, nobody has to work anymore. Everything is continuous and automated. We have lean flows, which allow that you can accelerate your delivery because everything is much more trimmed down than in large and complex projects. Also, you want to measure everything because once you have released something, this is only 30%, right? After it's released, you need to know, is it working? How is it working? How do people like it? And typically it fails eventually, so you need to be able to recover fast. So recovery, fixing, fix forwarding, and being able to do that fast is also important about DevOps. And last but not least, it's the culture of shared responsibility, right? Which is kind of the sum of everything, and which comes again from the idea dev and ops, put them together, you have shared responsibility. And well, typically you say culture comes last, but a few things hopefully throughout this presentation is that culture is still the most important thing that you need to work on when you get this whole stuff running. Another remark before we go to the topics, and I bring this up, I think every time I'm presenting about anything, it's the typical journey when you learn something and the so-called Mount Stupid, or in the Dunning-Kruger zone, meaning the moment when you think you know everything and you're very happy to talk to everybody about it and tell them how things should be. But in fact, you are just at the beginning because you just have overcome the first hurdles and the real learnings are just ahead of you, right? And when I talk about how do we do DevOps, how do you do this, how do you do that, I'm not sure if we are already over that point and we are somewhere here, or maybe we are still here because we've tried a lot, we failed a lot, and we are in a good iteration, but it might still be that we again discover, okay, we need to do things better. So everything I'm saying here, you need to take with a grain of salt. We are still in the process of learning, and a lot of things I'm presenting you, we are still also in the process of building up, right? I would say, we are meanwhile very good, but we still have a lot of things we need to do and we can do. Okay, so where did we start? And now I'm getting back like 4 or 5 years ago from now. We had projects, we had a lot of projects, we had more complex projects, and we typically had eventually some struggles in these projects. I mean, we've been always successful and I think our customers liked us, but the teams had to work usually very hard to get the stuff over the finishing line. A lot of escalations, frustrations on both sides, right? And if we now, afterwards, you know things much better, right? But some of the issues we had back then is that we worked on very, very large pieces of work, right? We have large user stories. Typically, they were crossing multiple sprints, sometimes even months to be implemented. Which meant that when we look at the code, we had feature branches or branches which were living for the same time. And when the moment arrived that you had to merge them, everybody was scared because you had to merge like a 2 months long branch into a piece of code. And eventually you had a lot of conflicts and you have been spending a lot of time solving them. Usually this was, this led to the fact that all this work was done at the end of the sprints, right? So at the 11th day, everybody started to merge, test, and started to sweat because, of course, a lot of things went wrong at that moment because it's simply not that you do bad work or you're stupid, but if you have to merge in 5 or 6 features the last day, this can go good, but it also can go wrong. This also led to the fact that all the QA had to be done at the end of the sprint. So we have been creating our own bottlenecks because suddenly at the last day or the last few days, everybody had to test everything and everybody had to fix everything because on Monday we wanted to provide the release, right? Besides that, another side aspect of this was that we wanted to provide only finished user stories to the customer. But if you work like, let's say, multiple weeks or sometimes even months, this means that the customer doesn't see anything of that for quite a long while. Right? And then after a few weeks or months, the customer sees it, and then it says, oh, okay, I would have expected it to be like that, right? And then, okay, you look at a few weeks of work and say, okay, shit, I need to do it again, right? You do this 2 or 3 times, and then you start to get really frustrated. And overall, we had this I call it release day hectic, right? That on day we needed to provide a release, the team was completely blocked. Everybody was running back and forth. And this was never a pleasant situation. And by the way, again, I'm not saying we completely eliminated all that, but at least we're trying to address it. So when you talk about improvements, there's this super old cartoon which is showing in a lot of slides about Agile improving, and it's these 2 guys here, right, having this cart, but they don't have a wheel, and there's the other guy trying to offer them the wheel, and they say, oh, we have no time for that right now. And when we talk about improvements and all this DevOps stuff, in a way you could say it's the same. When we started our journey, right, we came up with a lot of ideas. And we said, hey, if you do this, it would be awesome. We automate everything. You don't have to do any work anymore. And everybody's like, yeah, okay, but we have no time for that, right? And now you could say, if you just look at this picture, you could say, okay, people just don't realize when they could have life easier. But in the end, there's also the other side of the story. If you are a developer, if you're a team, and you anyway are already completely booked with work, and then you have the additional work of writing automation, writing tests, changing your pipeline, in theory, and that's the above picture, this all sounds nice because eventually you will be done and everything goes smooth. But probably you know from experience, like with any other code, you write the automation, you write your new pipeline, and then you start debugging and fixing it. So instead of just doing your code, suddenly you also have to do code to support the code on top, right? And that's of course where, often a lot of these initiatives get to slow down because simply nobody has time to work on this additional stuff, and everybody's focused on getting the actual job done, and adding then another level of complexity is difficult. So yeah, I think a lot of these fancy ideas about improving and also our own fancy ideas, right, sometimes forget that you're not only the guy with the wheel trying to make everything easier, but you, last but not least, also the one introducing more work and complexity and risk. So I said we had multiple iterations, right? And the first one was, let's say, we were at the very beginning. In most of the projects, all the builds were done entirely manual, right? Yes, we were using like CI servers, but essentially somebody had to commit, somebody had to click, and to wait, to download, to distribute it. Also, this had to be done on a lot of different environments and stages. Like we had projects with dev stage, pre-prod, prod, actual prod, fixed dev, QA, right? So you had one build and you had to do it for 6 or 7 environments. And yeah, it was like whack-a-mole. When one was working, 6 others were not working, right? And it essentially did not help you to get anything more stable and better. It just led to the fact that you need to fix something on 6 environments. And on the 7th, it was still failing. We had to do release notes, but we had to do them manually. So somebody was copy pasting the Git log or the Jira, right? I mean, this was probably not the biggest deal, but still, when you anyway are full at your day and you want to make a release, and then you need to start copy pasting stuff for your release notes, this just gets to you. So, okay, we came in and we thought we have super bright ideas. So we went to iteration 1, right? We tried to define some principles. And the idea was, okay, if everybody works according to those principles, then everything will be bright and nobody has any issues anymore. In order to support with this, we made up a team, which was composed of senior developers from different areas, from different departments. And the idea was, okay, because they are so senior, next to their project work, they also can do this stuff, so they can support other teams. And then the idea was that this team, together with these principals, supplies all this stuff whenever a team needs it, right? So we created pipelines, we created scripts, we created ideas. And then the idea was, okay, any team can come, raise their hands and say, okay, I need your support. Or this team comes and says, okay, I think you need our support, we will help you. And both did not really work because the team, the senior team, first of all, if you have a team of only seniors, sometimes these guys and girls spend more time discussing with each other what's the best approach rather than actually doing it, but also they were also super busy, right? So a lot of these ideas were not possible to implement because also they were busy on their own, but also because they were kind of considered to be like this external entity. Nobody really wanted to ask them or needed to ask them because, I mean, every team was sufficient on their own, right? And then you come with some external crew and they are supposed to solve all the issues. So that's not something that is working out in reality. So then we went to the second iteration, and this is, I would say, the iteration we are working on right now. We still have a dedicated team, but this team, in large parts, I would say, is really dedicated for this, or with at least with a dedicated time, right, for all this DevOps work. And this team is still doing the groundwork, preparing pipelines, preparing scripts, principles, etc. But now we try to do this more like a support for the project teams and to really become a part of the project teams. So when we start a project, the idea is that one or multiple of these members become also part of this team for a period of time so that they better know from the beginning, okay, what's the project reality? What are the things that really need to be solved? And also, and this is later on much more important, to train and to kind of support the customer and the team with all these ideas, understand why are we doing this, how are we doing this, etc. And the main principle now, what we are working on is in this whole DevOps endeavor we are doing right now, is what we would call internally the small batches idea, right? And this small batches idea is the result of us looking back and thinking, okay, from all these crazy ideas about DevOps and about improving the work, what is really the one thing where we believe we would get the most value out of it across everything if we would implement it? And the answer for this was, okay, it seems like one of the main issues is that we create bottlenecks at the end of a sprint. We create bottlenecks when we want to do releases because we have so big chunks of work, right? And if we manage to make this smaller, we hopefully make it easier for the developers to implement it, but we also make it easier, for example, for our requirement engineers to write a user story, because a small user story is much more easy to write, to finalize, and to explain than a big one, right? That's, if you look back now, this kind of logically. So we started by implementing a rule which says, okay, no user story should be bigger than 3 story points, which in 3SS terms, 3 story points means it's probably on 3 to 4 man days usually. Yeah? So that's how we try to approach it. And of course, this is an average, right? We still have user stories which are far larger, but what we try to achieve is whenever we identify them, we try to see, okay, how can we split them? If we have a 10 story point user story at the PI planning or the sprint planning, okay, can we make this smaller? Again, this is now one of the things where I say we are working on it. I'm not saying we are fully there yet, but that's the idea, right? Then the other important things is, maybe to go to the last point, is that we aim at really to deliver very fast and very often. And the small batches enable us because it's much easier to create a release if there are only small changes than to create a release if it's very big changes. If we deliver fast and often, this also means that we often have things which are not finished inside. So we need to use feature flags so that we can toggle functionality and features if they're not yet fully available or if they make no sense to be tested, etc. And last but not least, of course, all this together helps us eventually to decouple a release from a deploy. So we can provide a build, we can release it, and to deploy it, it's easy to just put it into the store or to enable a feature flag, for example. And yeah, from all the things that you could think about in DevOps, this is the one thing we are trying to focus right now, everything which supports the small batches approach. And besides the whole infrastructure and development topic, an important part, and this is something which we cut short in the previous iterations, is first of all to explain the why to everybody, including the customer, but also the team, and to ongoingly support them. Because this shift of the way how we are working, obviously, like any other shift, comes with challenges, right? And then it's important for the DevOps team and for us all to not let the team solve them on their own, but try to support it. Okay, suddenly, and that's typically if you change something, even with our glorious CI and CD, in the first iterations, it's more complicated than it used to be, right? So you need to help and provide support there. And last but not least, and this is one of the essential things, is that we try to really become one team with our customer. Yeah, so everything we do, planning, execution, we try really to not have this border or this differentiation anymore between us and the customer, but to really do this as one. So why do we think that this whole small batches stuff is so important for us, and why it's the one thing we try to really focus on in everything? And that's one of the things that explains it very well in the DevOps idea, is this concept of lead time versus process time. And to explain this very briefly, if you look at the so-called value stream inside a project, so the value stream means the moment from an idea in your head or in somebody's head to the moment it actually provides value, right? And value means a user is able to use it. Because unless you reach this point, everything is just an idea and a theory. So any feature is great, but it must be used by a user in production, right? And this is where you deliver value. And if you look at the moment from an idea to it being actually released, there are a lot of steps. And I mean, this slide, this is now just a few examples. Not everything is exactly like that. Every project, every team, every company does it different, but I think we can agree that there are a lot of steps, right? You decide, you define it, you design it. You need to implement it, you need to test it. Somebody needs to accept it, it needs to be released, it needs to be deployed, etc. And one of the things, if you look at most of the projects, or even if you look at your own work, right, is that you figure out on the long run that often when things are not going as they should, the problem is not that the individual steps are taking that much time. The problem is usually that the transition from one step to the other, so the lead time, is taking so much time because you have finished something, but before the next step can begin, so before, for example, the tester can start, there's 2, 3, 4, 5 days of waiting, right? Then the tester tests, and now two things can happen. Everything is great, then it moves on. Okay, we don't need to talk about it, but more likely the tester will find some issues. So the tester will give it back. So what happened is you waited 4 to 5 days only to get it back again to your desk. And this is where the concept of the lead time really starts to clarify a lot of these issues. I mean, look, for example, at how you treat emails. Typically answering emails is a matter of a few minutes. Yet still, some people are waiting days for me to reply. And that's not because the answer is so complex, but because I'm unable to really prioritize it and answer in time, right? And with the development approach and the small batches, the theory is the smaller each of those increments is, the less time everybody needs, but the easier it's also to hand over. Because if I only have a very small piece of a feature for the tester, handing it over and testing it together can be done much faster. Also, the risk of it being not correct is probably smaller, but even if not, to fix it, it's also easier. Yeah? And this is why having small batches leads to hopefully having all those individual steps smaller, but more important, to make it also easier to put them through this whole stream. Because in the end, all the process time in a team or in a project is wasted time. Yeah? Because nothing is happening. You have just things, features, implementations waiting. Yeah? And this is what you need to work on eliminating. So I was talking about a very short case study, and well, it's maybe case study is already a big word, but it's just something we have recently experienced in the past year, right? Where we had the situation, we have a team and we have a customer. and both with very small adjustments are the same, like in scenario A, the original situation in scenario B. The only thing that changed was the work mode. And since we're talking about this DevOps stuff, what changed is that we try to get into the DevOps work mode with the customer and the team. And the question, and you can guess the answer is, was the outcome different, right? So if we look at what was the original situation, we had a customer team and we had our own team. We did prioritization and backlog grooming and everything, but we kind of did it separate. So on 3SS side, we looked at it, we looked at the priority, and then we went back to the customer and said, okay, this was our prioritization. This is the order how we will do it. And by the way, this we had to descope because, yeah, there is no time for that. This is the first issue, right? The customer was not really part of these discussions. They just saw us coming back with a priority they might or might not agree with. And in addition, the message that some stuff will not be done yet. So, yeah. Besides that, we had a lot of delays, and we also frankly had some quality issues because, yeah, we have been very ambitious. The scope we accepted and handed over to the team was simply too big. And now everybody is working very hard on getting it done, but there's a limit of what you can do. So the team was frustrated and the customer was unhappy because they saw all those issues. And essentially, in the end, they kind of lost the trust in us being able to really deliver. So what happens if somebody loses trust? You have escalations, you need to do reports every day. It was a very unpleasant situation. The result was that, yeah, the implementation did not really meet the customer requirements and expectations, but also not our own, right? So we had like a lose-lose situation. And overall, we were very slow with doing releases, and it was very hard. Remember one of my earlier slides. So yeah, eventually we went into the first release and we needed to do a second iteration. And luckily enough, the customer kind of gave us the chance to prove that we can do better. And then there were a few changes done. Again, the team remained nearly the same. The good thing maybe was that like a few useless managers like me were not anymore part of that team to that detail. I think that also helped. But overall, it was the same. But what changed was that the customer was really now involved in every single step from day one, in the definition, in the prioritization, in the planning. We did everything together, or the team and the customer did everything together. And this created like a really 100% transparency. So it was and is all the time visible to the customer. First of all, what's the status of things, and what is possible with what can I expect, what can I not expect, right? So that's much more reliable for the customer. Because now everything was done together, it's also more like one big team where people from the customer have some roles, people from 3SS have some roles, but we don't have anymore like these parallel organizations which only have a few interfaces. And besides all this, we managed to go into this constant and frequent delivery of builds, also from the very beginning. Even especially at the beginning, this meant that the builds we deliver contained a lot of unfinished stuff. And it sometimes probably was hard to identify what is really the change or what is the improvement. But in the end, if you do this from the beginning, you also can keep track of everything, and it's much more transparent. The results are that the definition and the implementation is now much better aligned with the expectations from the customer, but also with what we can really do. There's, as I said, this common understanding about where are we, what are the challenges, and what is the real progress, right? Nobody needs to hide anything anymore because they're afraid of the next escalation. And the customer can accept what they get because, first of all, they know that this is what they will have, and they know exactly how the detailed status and the progresses of everything. And as a small side note, it's now meanwhile also possible from the moment that an issue is reported until we really provide a fix to have a turnaround time from 12 hours. Right? So that's of course maybe a special case. And if you have a very large issue or a new feature, that's not realistic, but it just shows the big improvements towards where we have been before. Overall, yeah, we have a much better outcome in the quality, in the scope. We achieved more, right? And also the time to market. So every of the single criteria why you would say a project is good or bad has improved. last but not least, of course, the customer satisfaction. I think they went from one of our most unhappy customers to one of our most happy customers. And besides, of course, an awesome job by the team and great work, one of the factors that helped to get there was this whole change of the work mode. Not so much the technical setup around it, but really the work mode and the processes with the customer. And that's largely the area of this whole small batches idea. So now I've been talking a lot about processes and work mode, but in the end, one of the aspects of DevOps is also, let's say, your pipeline and how do you build all this stuff in your setup. So I wanted to share also a little bit of more hands-on information about what we are using, how we are using it, and what we are doing with it. So maybe just a quick overview about the main items from our pipeline, right? So we are using GitLab and GitLab CI on our own environments in our own data center. We use Docker containers. I'll explain a bit later on for what we use them in the pipeline. We use, besides GitLab CI and the GitLab CI YAML files, we also use quite an amount of bash scripts to do individual jobs. We use SonarQube for code analysis, and we use different tools to build. But for example, for iOS, we are using Mac Stadium because one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted not to be relying on individual developers and their workstations. So with Mac Stadium, we are using essentially, I won't say in the cloud, because in the end, it's also just a Mac standing somewhere in a data center, but we're using remote Macs to do our iOS builds, so that we don't have to depend on developers and their PCs or Macs in that case. We use, or we start to use right now, also for automated testing, amongst a few other things, two tools I want to talk about briefly. One is Zootest and the other one is Cypress. And of course, a large part of our work, you have been talking to me a lot about processes, etc., is Jira and Confluence, and also we have this connected to our GitLab. For the measurement part, we are introducing right now, for example, Sentry as a remote debugging tool, which gives us information about JavaScript errors and exceptions from deployed applications, and we use Elastic, Logstash, and Kibana to ingest log files, to analyze them, and to keep track. A few more details will now come on the following slide. So yeah, all our pipelines, with the exception from iOS, are using pre-configured Docker containers. So we use Docker images where we have all the SDKs, for example, to build Android, with all the right dependencies installed. And for us, this works out quite well, because if we have Docker containers, we can just spin them up when we need to do a build. Everything can be installed only in this Docker container. It has no effects on anything else. We can be sure that we install exactly the versions we need, and we can clean it up easily inside the Docker container when we tear it down again. So that makes, first of all, the builds more reliable. The dependencies for the builds much easier, because we don't have the problem that, okay, we have a different Java runtime installed, or some SDK version is deprecated, or maybe we have two conflicting libraries, etc. We can be making sure that our build environment is really isolated and optimal. And we can easily migrate this now from project to project, because we don't have to go somewhere and set something up. We just have to provide the Docker image or the Docker container for the new pipeline and use it. We use a number of bash scripts, as I said, because if we have everything inside a GitLab CI, then this GitLab CI becomes probably very convoluted and unreadable. And there are also some limitations, of course. So that's why the GitLab CI, for a lot of detailed steps, uses bash scripts to execute them. And a small word on SonarQube. We are using SonarQube more as an information tool. So SonarQube is not breaking our builds in case it finds issues, or maybe it reaches a certain level of quality issues. This tool is used then by the teams. They can look into it, they can see some findings, and then they can prioritize and plan if and what from these findings they want to work on. From our experience now, this is much better, because otherwise you will have the problem. There's probably a lot of builds will be stuck and fail, maybe even just because of some external libraries or other dependencies. And also it's kind of a good addition to code review, because if you know SonarQube, it can give you a lot of information about your code. And especially if you try to get onboarded in a new language or new SDK, this information can come in quite handy. So the overview is, is pretty much like this. So in the centerpiece, we have, of course, GitLab CI. So this is in our own data centers. And with GitLab CI, we use then different runners. And each of those runners typically uses Docker containers to do the job, or they access, for example, Max Stadium to do a build then on the Max Stadium and get the artifact back. Our Docker containers, which we use for the different type of images, for example, for web, for Android TV, we use a Nexus repository to host those Docker containers. The reason is mostly that when we started with all this, GitLab did not yet have such a repository. Meanwhile, GitLab also provides the possibility for Docker repositories. So maybe at one day we might switch to that. But at the moment, it's still working out fine for us. Then we have, let's say, the reporting area, and this is going mostly to Jira, where whenever we make a release, whenever we make a deploy or a build, we update various things in Jira about the features and the user stories that are part of this build. So we can update the versions, we update the status of tickets, and we can also create release notes if it's a release out of this, which will be also posted to Confluence, for example. So this is how we create release notes. This is how we keep Jira up to date for a lot of things, and how we can keep track of our versions. And then, as I said, we also give out stuff to SonarQube to be able to just see the quality of our code, to see maybe possible security issues, etc. And then on the left-hand side, we have obviously also some releases. We use for all our mobile and Android TV builds, we use Firebase Beta to distribute those builds. And when we talk about web applications or also web-based smart TV applications, we are uploading our artifacts to web servers. We have some kind of a structure on the web servers. I will show this a little bit later, how you can easily access different feature branches or different build versions on a web server. When we go further to our pipeline itself, usually it has by default a few stages, which we try also to keep consistent across the different pipelines we are building up. So we have a linting stage. This is SonarQube, for example. We have obviously a build stage. We have a deploy stage, release, fixes, and then finishing. These are the steps. And as I said already earlier a few times, these steps use various bash scripts. So you see here, for example, just a screenshot from one of the pipelines to show you kind of what we have different scripts for. So we have, for example, a script to make Confluence release notes. We have various Git flow scripts. I will talk about that a bit later. And helper scripts to make sure that we build the right version and then we increase the version in the right way. All this with the goal, of course, to make all those steps much easier, right, in the process. The result of this, and this is now just the history, the build history from one of our recent projects, is you see here how many pipelines have we been executing each month and each day. So here it's for the year, and here it's for the month. And if you look at the year, you will see that of course, with some deviations, I would say that the amount of builds or pipelines we have been running remains pretty consistent. Obviously, we have peaks, but it's kind of evening out overall. And if I compare this to other projects, we would have sometimes, you could easily see in the monthly view when we have a sprint end, because then you have the peaks, and in the yearly view when we had like bigger important releases, because then you also had a peak. And for me, looking from the outside, I think that's also a good sign, because if we keep this like more on a moderate level, or let's see on a rather constant level, this means that we managed to avoid a little bit, on the one hand, these peaks where everything became hectic, but at the other hand, we have been able to constantly deliver builds, right? Of course, I'm aware that not every pipeline is a valuable pipeline build and so on, but if you take like 3 or 5 steps back, then I think the picture is okay. Also an important part of how we do builds and how the pipeline is how we use Git and how we use the Git flow. And this is something when I now was preparing for this presentation, I talked with Radu, who's like the team lead of this whole DevOps stuff, and who essentially came up with the way how we can use Git and Git flow and trunk-based development in a better way. Because also here, we had different ideas in the past, and we started before the days of Git, we started with SVN, which of course you have a completely different strategy of using version control. And when Git came up, Git had this possibility to do branches. So in the first years of Git, everybody was doing branches like crazy. And this led to the things I mentioned before. Suddenly you had like hundreds of branches. Merging them back was a nightmare. And on the other hand, pure trunk-based development is maybe also not the best use of Git. So what we are employing right now is a mixture of, let's say, Git flow with trunk-based development strategy. It's now called, if you want to have a good name for that. And the idea is actually, it's still very much aligned with what you do in Git or with Git flow. The main difference is that we try, as I mentioned before, to keep our feature branches really short-lived, and that we merge them all the time back into develop, and that we treat develop as something from which we can and are building all the time. If you want to have a little bit of a visualization, let's say we have here different feature branches. So we of course do some commits in develop, and then we create a feature branch to work on a feature. We maybe create another one to work there, and even a third one. And then these feature branches might or might not be made merged back at that stage, but the important thing is that they will always be merged back into develop, and that we are able to make a build from develop at that very moment already. And this is probably one of the biggest changes towards other approaches. And of course, this only works if we keep develop clean and if we keep the feature branches short-lived. Otherwise, merging back into develop might become really a nightmare. Once we have all the stuff in develop, we make a release a release branch, and merge this release branch into master and tag it. And if needed, bring it back also into develop. All these things, as I've been showing before, are done with scripts, yeah? So that we can really automate everything regarding the tagging, creating the right versions, and reduce the human error with this stuff. And the benefit for us is that we can rely all the time that what we have on develop is probably not yet production ready, but it's stable, and we can create builds out of this. And this means that also concepts which we used in the past, like for example, creating a release candidates a few days or weeks before release, and then working on a release candidate branch, we don't need to do that anymore. Hotfixes, we tend to not use hotfixes anymore, or hotfix the concept of hotfixing by creating another branch and hotfix something on master. The idea is that we use master really, really only for doing releases and nothing else. And if we look at maybe some examples, I took now from our typical pipeline, how it looks like, just to give you a picture. So these are a number of stages from our GitLab CI. In this case, it's, for example, the feature build and the deploy step. And you see that the feature step is actually not that big, right? Okay, we limit it to feature branches because nothing else should be resulting in a feature build anyway. And then you can see that nearly everything else is sorted out to some scripts, right? So in this case, of course, because it's Android, we use Gradle for that. And if you look here at, for example, creating a deploy, it becomes a bit more interesting, because you see that we use a version script to make sure we put the version to the right number. Then we make a build. We update our Confluence pages with the release notes, and we update the version again if needed. And this is an example. If you look at other build types from the stages I've mentioned before, it looks pretty much the same all the time. This is how we use our GitLab CI. Inside the scripts itself is also the scripts are really not that big, and this is just one of the scripts I picked randomly to show you what's going on. This is, for example, when we create a release branch, the script for that. You see that it works with the version, and then essentially it creates a branch, it commits into this branch, and it pushes from that branch. And that's mostly what is happening in this small script as a preparation for release. And with this, we have achieved that on the one hand, we have a very simple GitLab CI, which is easy to understand, easy to maintain, and that we have an easy set of shell scripts or bash scripts, which are also easy to maintain, easy to modify, and easy to understand. And since I'm talking here about versioning, let's also look briefly about how we do versioning at 3SS meanwhile, because versioning was also a topic which was complicated. And small remark, when I say at 3SS, this still does not include all the projects, but the projects where it's applicable. In the past, we had different ideas of versioning. We used semantic versioning with 3 digits. We used, for example, the sprint number in the version. We used manual increases of versions, and the result was that the version numbers were pretty much useless. I mean, you really needed to understand what it means to know where to work on, but even more so, the whole concept behind the versioning was the problem, because if you make versions per sprint, you are far away from this constant delivery idea. And if you make a fix, you need to go back to version based on a sprint and fix it there, etc. So this was a problem in both in understanding the versions, but also the way we use them. So now we have a 4-digit versioning, where we have the first digit is always the major release. And this is something which I put here automatic, but I think that's a typo. That should be manual, because the major version is something which is artificially defined. So let's say maybe we keep the 0 while we're in development, and the first release into the store gets a 1, and then it should be only changed if you really have really major changes. Right? So significant, not adding a feature, more like rewriting the whole app. That's when it should change. Then we have the release. That's the second digit, and this, you saw the script before, gets now automatically updated. With every release, we include it, we increase it. So whenever we make a release, we increase this number. The third digit, and if you listened closely to what I tried to explain before, it most of the time should be 0, is the hotfix number. As I said, we try to eliminate hotfixing as much as possible, but of course it might be that there's the need for it. So we have a digit to indicate the hotfixes. We also have a script for hotfixing, so this will be automatically increased. And then this is the one which should have been manual at major, because obviously the amount of merges into develop is also something we count up automatically. And we then reset with the build, with the release. And that's how we create our versions. While this might on the first look maybe be a bit confusing and not really giving a lot of help when you look at the versions, the important part is that because of our concept of not doing hotfixes and trying to fix issues on develop and making new builds, the need to go back to a specific version is really not that high. And the versions for us are more used to keep track of when did we release something and we report bugs. We don't even need to report them to a specific version because we know it's the latest, right? So, but sometimes there still might be the need. So of course we need to keep track of the versioning. So that's how we use Git, how we use the pipeline, how we use Git flow, how we create releases, and how we version them. And now, after we did all that stuff, what's happening in the end? How do we deploy it? And here, just a few examples now on what we do in the deployment and in the linting, etc. So the first one I was talking about the upload to a web server for web and web-based smart TVs. I'm not sure how familiar you are with smart TVs, but some of them, like for example LG or Samsung, applications on these devices are essentially web applications built in HTML5. So what you can do is you can either deploy those applications as packages on the TV And for public releases, you need to do that. But in the development, it's much easier if you have just one application. That's what we did. And this one application is, we call it the developer portal. And from this, you have easy access to develop, which is always the latest, or to dedicated environment or branches, which is on the TV compared to what we did in the past. Often, you have a feature branch, you have a feature build, you make a package specifically for that build, you deploy it on the TV. That's like 30 minutes lost just for that step. Now this page is automated, updated automatically, and you can just go there and select the right branch. This was something which came from the web and from the Smart TV team. They implemented it in their projects, and the DevOps team took this over as part of the pipeline because it really is helping a lot. When we talk about linting, I talked about SonarQube, and maybe for those who are not that familiar with it, just a quick overview. So SonarQube has a lot of fine-tuning you can do how you analyze the code. But what you use it for is you want to analyze code smells, so complexity of code, unclean code. You want to analyze vulnerabilities, especially maybe in web or backend projects. And SonarQube comes with a lot of rules and detection for that. So you can more or less use it out of the box and let it run. It's also able to identify potential bugs because maybe you didn't close a statement properly. You have variables which can remain undefined, or variables which always return the same value. This kind of thing SonarQube helps you to identify. And it's just a good addition to manual code reviews to understand, okay, do we have work to be done on our code base? And the teams start now to use this also to, as I said, as an information tool. So it's not breaking any builds, it's not breaking any pipelines, but the teams can go there and can have a look and then decide together, okay, this seems like something we want to fix, or this seems like something we want to improve. And we see this is just one example here out of 1 or 2 projects now, where then this trend is really also going down because eventually the things are being improved. We also can provide SonarLint as a plugin for most of the IDEs so that the developers have a local linting by exactly the same rules as the pipeline has. And if you pay close attention, then you see that the coverage is at 0.0%. And that might maybe sound scary to some or raise some concerns, but I'll talk about later now also about our testing approach. And these are now just 2 more examples of the details of how SonarQube works. So here, this is, for example, a potential bug identified by SonarQube. And this is pretty neat because it tries to qualify it. It tries to give you an idea about the effort to fix it, but let's maybe not talk about the idea of 15 minutes. But it also gives you more detailed information why this is a bug, what is the problem, and how to solve it. So that's very helpful. And again, talking about bottlenecks, talking about time, no human being is needed to create this kind of stuff and to point out the obvious in the code. You can also have a general assessment. So you see that there's like security, maintainability, and code smells. And you see that it's putting it into different clusters based on the rules, and it tells you how much potential depth you have and how much time it might take you to solve it. Yeah, I mean, all these numbers you have to handle with care, but it's a good indication. So on the testing, you saw the 0.0 coverage. So the question is, why is there no coverage for unit testing, for example, in this specific project? And what I want to say for that is that we experienced in our typical project that the environments and the backends we work are in constant development. So tests without mocks are breaking a lot. Of course, good unit tests should use mocks, but let's say if you want to do them without, it's not useful. And even if you do them with mocks, you need to update them every other day. If you don't really do test-driven development, and I think like most of the people in the world, we are also not really doing it, then the concept of unit tests has also limited use in some specific cases. Yeah, and for us, we have really limited client-side logic because we are mostly a presentation layer. So unit tests, we are introducing them now for specific parts, but on the large, other methods than testing are more valuable for us than unit testing. For us, it's more valuable to have integration tests, and integration tests, because we are so much relying on UI, usually can come at a later stage when the UIs and the features have reached a certain level of maturity and stability. Because if you want to test a feature, you write an integration test and the backend changes and the UI changes, you add the same time as you have development time for maintaining your integration tests. And at the beginning of a project, that's just added work without any value. So we try to do this at a later stage when we have a stable UI. What we use for this is then, I mentioned it at the beginning already, to pick out now two things. We use a bit more in different projects, but part of our default pipeline, meanwhile, for the smart TVs, we are working on SUTest. SUTest is a tool for cross-device testing on smart TVs. And the important thing for us is that it tests smart TVs by doing actually infrared input. So it's not like you, in a Selenium way, you pick elements and by JavaScript or HTML commands, but by JavaScript commands, you execute logic. You actually really just send the input from the remote control as a user would do it. And for a test, especially for an integration test, that's a much more reliable and realistic scenario because it's slower and it's more close to the experience that an actual user will have. Another thing we like about SUTest is that also as a non-developer, you can easily write tests because you have a drag and drop editor where you can use commands, you can click them together, and need to have an understanding about logic and some keywords, but you don't need to write the tests. Yeah? And what we have seen in projects where we employ this is that especially the regression testing time has been decreased a lot. Yeah? Once we have reached a stable application and the UI has been consistent, we had really a fraction of the time we needed to test across different devices if we did it automated versus doing it manual. It's important to point out, of course, that this is still just an addition to manual testing. Yeah? So you will always need manual testing because it gives a different level of quality. It gives you a different insight on how the application really works. But there's a lot of things you don't need to have people doing it. This is the view on some of the results that you have. And here at the bottom left, you see a device. It's called Candybox. And this is an Ethernet connected IR blaster. So this helps us through the internet to send commands like a remote control. A nice side outcome of all this was that we have also been able to create a remote test lab where we have a number of TVs you see here in the bottom. And these TVs, we have put a high quality webcam in front, which you can also zoom in and log into different areas so that without being in the office, you can use this virtual remote control and the tool to interact with the TV as if you would sit in front of it. Yeah? So this can be used for troubleshooting, for testing some features. If you don't have the TV at home, or like right now, you maybe cannot come to the office because there's a lockdown. Yeah. Of course, anybody who tried to enter a 30-character URL via such a remote control using a webcam will not do that a lot, yeah, because it's really annoying. But if you have the application started and all you need to do is up, down, left, right, okay, etc., this is really working out fine. And here I also have a small video just to visualize this. And I'm not doing this now to advertise this specific tool, but just because I think the idea of testing on smart TVs and testing on different smart TVs is maybe something you don't do in every project. And I kind of like it in a way to see this kind of stuff. So you have to watch it with me. So what you see here is the automation we use on the different number of TV sets. I think it's an LG, it's in Samsung, it's a Vestel. And you see now that the same application is being opened. On some devices it takes longer than on others. And then you see that now more or less the same scenario is being executed on these devices. It's browsing through the navigation, going to the detail page of a specific asset, and then this small example test more or less is done. Yeah, usually you would then do playback at whatever, but for this small video, that's the purpose, just to show this to you. And even if this was now already very brief only, you can imagine only for this small case, if you need to do this on all the TVs manually, you can triple the time. And if you have this on 5 or 6 and more use cases, you, I think, quickly realize the time efforts we've been gaining by using this in a customer project. Another thing we have added now to our testing setup is Cypress, and this one we use for the web. We use this to run integration tests in the browser. It allows us to make screenshots, video captures of failed tests. It can be integrated or is integrated into our CI pipeline as well. However, because the tests take some time until they are executed, this is something which is not stopping builds, because it would be very annoying behavior for a developer if they have a very small build and then they have to wait 5 minutes until these tests are executed and the feedback is coming, because it's also a bit asynchronous. So this is also something we use separate, and we run tests. And here, when we talk about our status, we are at the early stages. We use this in a customer project together with the customer already, on a quite big scale, and now we are doing this internally and we're just building this up for our web platforms as well. The advantage is also here that even though it's JavaScript, it's very simple JavaScript, so you can write tests without a lot of detailed knowledge about JavaScript. You just need to know your way around basic commands and assertions. And what we have seen is that it requires team support, which needs to be planned in the project, because other than the black box testing we do with suit test, here we need to have ways to really interact with the UI. So there must be code changes must be done in order to be able to execute those tests properly. And this is something where the team needs to support. And coming back to the very beginning of my presentation, obviously, you need to plan that properly in with the team and help them to get there, because otherwise you just add workload to them, which they really don't need. Yeah, so this was now a bit more about some of the things in our pipeline. And I've been showing this because I wanted to, not only show like a bit of the theory about what we're doing and the more process stuff, but also more the technical stuff. But to summarize now a bit more from the things before, and so the first and the second half, so to speak, where are we right now? So for us, it took us at the moment at least 3 iterations to find an approach which we see starting to work, right? As I said at the beginning, we are far from being in the ideal state, meaning that everything is implemented. But first of all, our projects are working really good, and there is not this burning need to do constant changes. On the other hand, if we have learned now one thing, is that same as in the development, you want to do small batches. We also need to do this when we talk about DevOps and transforming everything. Instead of like having 10 big goals and then reaching none of them, we need to take it step by step, because everything which seems like a small change has impact on the teams. We need to explain it, we need to help them to get it done, and we also need to learn on our own how to really do it, right? It's not that we are experts in this area, so we need to take it step by step and adjust. This also means, of course, that we still have a lot of rooms where we can do more. Yeah, as I said, automated testing is, I think, at the beginning of where we want to be. The pipeline is rolled out in a lot of projects, but also still some more projects are still waiting for it. So there's still a lot of things we need to improve and learn, but I think we're on a good way. But one of the things that, we learned on that way is that before we can come with all those seemingly great ideas and push them on the people and come with principles and set up, we needed to really make sure that we also have the culture and the working mode which enables us to that. And if we go back to the initial image, which I was showing with those 5 bubbles where we had automate everything, measure constantly, and the top one was the culture, I think one of the key learnings so far is that even though you say culture comes last, if you don't have the culture, you also can't do all the changes you need to do and get them running. So what did we learn from all this? Very shortly, I think it's the most obvious, but also the most complicated thing is that to both the customer, but also internally, it's important to explain the why and provide the context. Right? So to explain that it's not about doing automation for the sake of doing automation or because it's now hip to talk about DevOps, but because there is value which everybody can get out, and value getting out, if you're in a team, means your work hopefully becomes less stressful and it becomes easier for you to focus on your key job, right? And that's what we try to do with this whole DevOps stuff. And if we are able to show and to explain it, but even more to show it, then it's also easier to implement changes. If we just come as people who make life more complicated, then of course the acceptance for all these ideas is rather limited. Working in small batches, two-sided. One is, I think it's the single one thing besides the transparency, which is really the big improvement and change in the whole work mode. But also when you talk about implementing these changes, as I said, you need to work in small batches. You can't come with a big pile of work or ideas and say, this is what we are now going to do. I mean, you can do it, but it will not work. Focus on delivering value. Again, both to the customer, but even more important when you talk about facilitating this transformation to everybody in your organization and the teams, because in the first place, this is where life should become easier. Yeah? And if people see that there's value, then it's also better to come with the changes. Thinking holistic, okay, this sounds like super generic, taken from any slide out there in the world, but I wanted to come back to the idea that we are not talking only about adding automation. We are not talking about building fancy pipelines or testing. And we are also not only talking about changing the work mode. It's something one does not work without the other. And you need to have a picture on how to change that. Overall, still, I think, at least for our case, we can say that the benefits of this work mode and the DevOps ideas we are trying to implement, they are more processes than technical stuff. The most important thing also from the case study was that we changed the way how we worked as a team and with the customer. Even if all the other stuff would not have been done, this was a big change. And this also, of course, means that your technology choices, they are secondary. If you use GitLab CI, if you use Docker or not, I mean, these are all details. Yeah? Whatever is better for you will work, but I think it's a mistake when you go into such an endeavor, you think, okay, now we virtualize everything, now we containerize everything, so it must work like a charm, but that's not what makes the difference. When you set up something like this, I think it's important to have the team of supporters and enthusiasts, and then start getting it work there and then expand by, again, I'm repeating it a lot, providing value to the teams. And I think with the DevOps team we are now having, this is a great start, because we have now a group of people who really wants to work on this, sees already the value because they create it. And now also the first teams are seeing the value that is generated by this. And suddenly, after really years of struggling to come up with the ideas and getting acceptance, now that there's some value which is visible, you see that people actually are asking proactively, hey, can we use this pipeline in our project as well? Then, of course, the no-brainers, right? You need to involve the people from team and customer side. Involving meaning, again, explaining, showing them what and why, teaching them how to use the stuff, how to get value out of it, how to understand, how to utilize the flow, so that they eventually, after a while, can do it without involvement from the DevOps team. And last but not least, you still need to support constantly, because especially at the beginning, you come with a new system and it would be a miracle if this works better than the old system, even if it should be working better. So you need to be able to support and improve things. And you need to be able to take feedback, and also ongoingly, even after phasing out, because the things were done, there's constantly the need to support. And support means showing how things work, listening, adjusting, and yeah. Last but not least, making just sure that the core work, the core roles can be done easier than it would have done without this whole DevOps stuff. Okay, I'm done with my slides. Nobody asked questions in between. This can be because I didn't take a breath and nobody had time, or there were no questions. But if you have any questions right now, I'm happy to answer them. And of course, if not, then I'm thanking for your attention, and I'm hoping that there was something interesting for you inside of this. Maybe even some learnings you could take, or some things which gave you a different perspective on items.
Before the participants can think about some questions, I would like to remind everyone that this meeting is recorded and we'll post it on YouTube. And if Stefan, do you agree to give us also the slides so we can add them on Git and everyone can download them if they want to look at them again?
Yes, yeah, they will be available.
And we will also put the link to Git on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So if those who expressed their intent to participate and could not be here can see it afterwards. So do you have any questions?
So hello, I'm Cosmin. So I really like the presentation and it was really to the point, really nicely done. I wanted to ask you about SonarQube. Do you use it as it is out of the box? Do you use community plugins? What kind of rules do you use when you analyze a project? Is it usable by default?
I would say that, let me just open it up without the screen sharing at the same time, so I'm not talking too stupid stuff. But I would say overall we use it more or less nearly out of the box. Yeah. We have, especially for iOS, it took us quite some while until we got it running, but this was not because the SonarQube configuration, but to get the relevant plugins running on our Mac Stadium, etc. Right? So we started to use it on Android and iOS. We have, I think, adjusted a little bit the quality gates because some of them were very strict, and especially with a lot of NPMs or other libraries, you had like 4,000 issues immediately, and this did not help. So I think we've been reducing the threshold a bit. Other than this, I don't think that there were any huge customization on our side. And about the plugins, I'm just checking. So yeah, we use a number of plugins mostly to support the different languages we are using here, but I would say nothing out of the ordinary. Yeah, just checking here. I would say it's pretty simple what we're using here. Yeah, we have about 15 plugins in there, mostly for the different languages, right? JavaScript, Kotlin, etc. in there.
And I guess those are the community plugins.
Yeah, it's all community plugins. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we didn't do anything really special on that. I mean, as I said, just with iOS, I think that's just about to be now deployed because this was really complicated to get the client-side plugins running. Yeah. But then again, of course, remember what I said at the beginning. I'm not the one who set it up, so I'm giving you second-hand information. But from looking at it, I would say it's all community plugins, and I know that we tweaked only the thresholds to be a bit more forgiving.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. And also regarding the client side, involving the client in the process. So, what is the report between your employees and the customer? So if we say you have 10 employees and you have one employee at the customer that's working on this project, how did they accept this? How many people were they able to offer you to guide you in the process?
You mean how many people the customer was able to offer us, or?
Yeah, compared to your number of employees.
I think that's a very different scenario depending on customer to customer. So when you remember the customers I talked at the beginning, those operators and classic broadcasters, they have no problem to throw 50 different kind of managers at a team of 10 from our side, because they have simply a lot of people that must be involved. And at the beginning, when we first introduced this, I think this was new to them, right? The concept of having more than a project manager and maybe an architect assigned to us was really new, because they said, okay, this is a lot of work we need to do, right? So because, I mean, we have these people involved in it. We have maybe, for example, product definition or design together with the customer. So I think if I look at it, I would say we have projects where it's probably our team size is double or maybe a bit more than double what the customers provide, but there are a lot of people from the customer involved. Like typically the customer provides a project manager, a product owner, maybe a design lead, an architect, and then ad hoc people that are needed. So you have like 4 people who are involved in the project with a team of 12, 14, 15 from our side, like that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, Stefan. Thank you for your presentation. I just want to ask you something related to the automated releases, let's say. So the mixture between Git and Jira, how do you, what difference do you think it is between Git and Jira versus Git and Rally, for example? I mean, I used to work with Rally, and now I switched to Jira on my project, and I find it, let's say, slower and not so competitive as Rally. But maybe the price is the thing that orders when customers go for Jira.
I must say that I personally never worked with Rally. So I've been using Jira from day one, and before Jira, I've been using Google Spreadsheets. So anything is better than that. But so this is really tough for me to answer in a comparison. But I think what Jira definitely cannot do good is if you have very large projects with a lot of user stories, with a lot of components, epics, and filters. Then you open it in your browser and you can watch it die. So, but I think this is kind of just again pointing to the general topic that if your project is set up like this, I think in Jira, then it's also set up wrong, I would say, because it must be, then maybe you need to spread it out across different instances, different boards, etc. That would be my assumption. API wise, so the APIs we use to update the Jira tasks, for example, from the CI flow, well, I can't compare them again to anything else, but it's not like this is a visible slowing down of the pipeline. So, yeah. But again, I did not work personally with Rally, so it's a bit difficult for me to make that comparison.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Until you think of other questions, if you do have some other questions, I have a remark and a question. So the remark is, towards the end, you said something that I really liked, which is you don't do things because they are cool or because it's a trend, but you try to understand, you as a company or you as a team, okay, not you, Stefan, but you try to see the purpose of that. And I think it's really important for every transition that is started, the agile ones, the DevOps ones, not to do something because it's cool, but to understand why you want that. Because that's that saying, if you know your why, you can bear almost any how. And any change comes with some hurdles. So that is something that I liked to to hear, or not to automate tests because it's cool to automate everything. Do we need everything automated or not? Or what do we need to automate? And the question is, during or towards the end, you said something that people need support, or that you try to support teams and customers. Can you think of an example of how teams are actually supported to apply all those principles and embrace the new culture that you try to create?
Well, I can try again. I mean, as with everything, I'm sure we're not where we should be, probably also with giving that support. But so what we tried at the beginning when we came up with this new approach, so the iteration 2, as I called it, we had like an initial kickoff workshop, an internal one, where we try to explain all the things, and we kind of try to cover everything, the why, how, what, etc. in a workshop. Yeah? And we felt pretty great about this, but what happens is you do this workshop and then everybody goes out of the workshop, and 2 weeks later,
nothing changed.
You had also a lot of other input in these 2 weeks, right? So this was just one of many. And so the change that we are trying to really do now is that we have the people of the team, so of the DevOps team, being part of the actual project team for at least a while at the beginning. So that they can not only do all this technical stuff, but also really guiding a little bit in the work mode towards the customer and the team itself, and explaining this to them and helping them with some things. Okay, how do you really apply this pipeline in the right way, and maybe how can you get to using this principle? And mostly, of course, everything. How can you actually provide a release? This was, for example, one of the major fears at the beginning when we said, okay, you deliver often, even if it's not really finished. And then it was like everybody, oh, but this means we give out broken stuff to the customer, and then the customer will be crazy because the feature is broken, and then they will report bugs, and then it will be angry. Yeah, and of course, from the old way of working, this is what happens. Yeah, but what happened in especially also this case study, which I mentioned, is the support was to explain this and show this from the customer from the beginning. Okay, we used to give you after 3 weeks this feature, and now we give it to you already after the first few days or week. You need to be aware that if you look at this, don't judge it by the final design, but look at it, give us any input, and we work on that. So yeah, I'm repeating the same. It's all about explaining. Also the support.
And one key in this part of delivering something not in months but in weeks or days is the process of splitting the business value into smaller chunks of business values. How was for you the process of making, or what was the biggest challenge in the teams that you know, to embrace or to get used to the process of splitting the big business value into smaller ones and stick to that? Because that's a big challenge in many teams. And what they actually end up trying to do is expand the time in order for the bigger business value to have a chance of being done, instead of sticking to that fixed time and splitting the business.
Yeah, I think if you look back on how we did it in the past, we had a feature. This feature was like a set of 5 screens and a very, very long description. And then, of course, you have like, I don't know, crazy people like me who, of course, always ask for something, right? And then the feature becomes bigger and bigger. And so what we're doing now is, on the one hand, as I said, we are working these program increments. So we are planning in 2-week sprints, but every iteration of 2 to 3 months starts in this program increment planning. And there already we try, or the teams try to look at something, and let's say they have the user story of, I don't know, a play implementation or something which would be 14 story points or what. Okay, then on that high level, just to try at that moment already, okay, how can we split it? And what are the typical dimensions? You can maybe split UI from logic, from API. That's like the first 3 things you can try to split. Yeah, okay. Then you have only the logic, which might be already easier than the logic plus the UI, etc. And then inside the logic, okay, can we focus first on only the data loading and then the caching and the other stuff? So, but this is a process which I think must be done by the team themselves, because you talk about what makes really sense in the functionality to be split. And this is where, yeah, I think every team needs to discover for themselves also what is really the right approach. You just need to be raising the awareness. Okay, guys, look, we have here 10 story points, so we need to come up with a solution to make it simpler. And again, sometimes we still have this 10 remaining because nobody sees the possibility. But best case, it's along these dimensions: UI, logic, API, and then in the logic to split it smaller. That's what we try to do.
Okay, and it works. To this kind of split is the rule of thumb in your teams.
I mean, again, everything works to a certain extent, and then there's still a lot of things which are complicated, because how much business logic can you really write without seeing the output in the UI? That's I saw it also at one point that actually we don't have that much client-side logic. So most of our features without the UI, yeah, okay, you can say I took all the data, I parsed it, but how to really see it? Yeah, so there's a limit on that, and then you just can say, okay, we isolate more features. So we first built the basic player. You can press play and pause. Okay, so that's okay. We don't need to write a player which can already skip, seek, has thumbnails, and switch 5 languages. Yeah, so in the past, this would have been one user story. Now maybe switching languages is another user story, even though it sounds ridiculous if you say, we talk about a drop down to change the language, but once you start working on it, you see what is hidden below there.
Okay. Thank you. Some other questions?
Maybe another one regarding your customers. How hard was it to convert them to this new approach? And how did you do it? What was the process? How did you approach them, let's say?
So one of the good things for us is that the biggest change of this approach was switching to this scaled agile framework, which I mentioned at the very beginning, even before we came up with stuff like DevOps. This is what makes the difference for the customers. And we are lucky that we had a very big customer in the past who we have been working this, and we kind of learned it from them. And this customer was very successful in their area. And so everybody said, I want the same thing as they are doing. And then we say, okay, but if you want the same thing, you also need to work like they are doing. And then they ask, okay, what does this mean? And then we came up with all this agile stuff. So, this is very fancy, right? We are an organization. We have requirement sheets, and we have committees, and we have waterfall. And said, okay, we can do it like this, but then you will for sure not get the same quality for the same price. It will be more expensive. It will take longer. And some customers, even to be honest, we have a customer who only was willing to adjust once they really saw that the previous approach was not working as they expected. And then after a year, okay, they said, okay, guys, we need to get better. So, and we said, okay, listen, we told you 1 year ago, this is how we would propose to do it. Yeah. Because waterfall has also a lot of other implications, right? It's if you fix the scope and the timeline and also the budget, you have like 3 things which, first of all, don't fit, but second of all, if you want to monitor those 3 things, they eventually will compromise the quality of the outcome, because you don't want to deliver what's best, you want to deliver what's possible, and possibly under the circumstances, and that's not a good area. And this is what eventually most of, or not most, all of the customers see. Some of them first have to go the different route to learn it, but it's like with everything, like the more success stories you build up, the more people are willing to it. And I talked about Android TV at the beginning, and I think it's important, without now being too much praising of us as a company. I think that where we have been working on these Android TV projects, the teams really did a great job, and the work they delivered is recognized as like benchmark solutions in that space. Yeah. So a lot of customers come and say, okay, we want what you did for this customer. We want what you did for that customer. And how did you get there? And then we sometimes also let them talk to the customers and say, okay, you just talk to them without us in the room and ask them why it worked. Yeah? And most of the times they get the feedback. One of the aspects was the work mode. And then I say, okay, I mean, if the boss of this company says it, then it must be true. Yeah? And I think you always need to come with the proof that this approach works. And the first time to get to the process, to the opportunity to deliver that proof is more difficult, but once you have it, it's easier.
Any other questions? So I have another question, remark, well, whatever you want to call it. I have this principle of if it's working, don't change it. And you said that that it was a little bit harder to convince the first customer to agree with this new approach. My question is, what made you as a company want to try this approach?
I think also the learnings from the very first time we did it with this, let's say, first customer who brought this in on their own. And we also saw the results from that project. We saw good results with, let's say, normal work mode. And we saw other projects where everybody was working day and night, and the results were still good, but they were with much harder sacrifices, right? And okay, and we thought, okay, how can we try to get to the same level of results, but just the easier way? I think that was the trigger, the learning we were happy to take from one of the customers. As usually, I mean, you can't come up with the things on your own. You need an outside view or an outside push to get there. And this was one we learned from there. And then it took us still a lot of ways to try to get into the same direction. And yeah.
Okay. So you had a demo version, and then you wanted more of it. Okay.
If you want to say like that, yeah.
Okay. Any other question? Stefan, would you like something else to add? Has something else come to your mind after?
I think I gave maybe already too much at once for everybody. So it's late. I think even 1 hour later for everybody in Romania. Yeah, I think really. Okay. So first of all, thanks for sticking with me so long, right? Even after hours, and I hope you got something out of that. No, I can only repeat again. First of all, keep in mind everything I just presented it. It's the work of many other people in the DevOps team. Outside of that, also our customers contributing to that. Second of all, I've been presenting a lot of things which we still have a way to go to get to the final state of everything working in the way we want it. So I think we are in a very good way. We're doing a lot of things right and work on them hard to improve them, but we are also not yet the ones who have the holy grail and know everything and do everything right. So that's just what I wanted to emphasize again.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation, for the ideas, for the honesty of not trying to show something that there isn't. And if there are no other questions, then we can close now and see you next month on the last Tuesday of the month, so on 28th, on another meetup. Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.